tonight. And I just wanted to say that at his Shiva 20 years ago, we learned that after he escaped to England from Germany, we never heard this recited, but perhaps my sisters did. After he escaped to England from Germany, he assisted many others to find refuge in England and later in America by finding sponsors for them, often by going door to door and trying to convince Jewish people to be sponsors, which meant taking financial responsibility for fellow Jews whom they didn't even know. Yehi zichron brach.
Can everybody hear? I haven't said anything yet, but can you hear me? Yes? Okay, I talk naturally, so it should be fine. If you have a problem, let me know. I must say I'm quite overwhelmed by everybody who came this evening. What a turnout, and there are people here that I haven't seen in a very long time, and I feel like I should have a guest book, you know, like to sign in someone so I remember who's here. It's just really very gratifying, and I hope that you'll find it worthwhile. My name is Miriam Litke, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about my experiences about Kristalnacht when I was still living in Berlin, November 9th, 1938, and then again what happened to the shul that we grew up in, my brother and I, 75 years later. I want to start with a little introduction, perhaps historically. In our lifetime, we have seen many upheavals. And perhaps since the destruction of the temple some 2,000 years ago, this upheaval expressed itself in the destruction of 6 million Jews and the desecration of the European Jewish community. What is now left of the European Jewish community are remnants and survivors, and those who heroically struggle to rebuild their lives. This upheaval has hit all of us in one degree or another. And this is part of my story and how this upheaval affected my life. 1933, Hitler came to power. It was also the year that I started going to school. Jüdische Mädchenschule, the Jewish girl for girls in Berlin. My father was in business in Litke. He had a shop, he had a store, and in 1933 he had to close that store. He was no longer allowed to have a business. He started to travel with his wares, and this is how he'd go on something during the week and come home always for Shabbat. In October the 27th or 28th, the night of in 1938, that was when the Nazis decided to get rid of all their Polish citizens. It was in the middle of the night, and there was a big knock on the door. I was the one who heard it. My bedroom was closest to the front door. And I jumped up and I thought, oh, for sure, my mother forgot to leave the latch open so that my father could open the door because he had been away. And I opened the door in expectation of seeing him, and there stood 2 or 3, I don't remember how many, black shirts, Nazis in uniform. And my instinct was to say to them, my papa's not at home. And then I saw his hat on the shelf there, and I said, well, I told the lie and I'm going to be in big trouble. However, my parents woke up and they came out. My father got dressed, and they took him along with his tallis and tefillin, and he thought he would be back soon. We didn't know that he was going to be shipped across the country to the border of Poland, which was called Spongin in Polish or Benchen in German. That was October 27th to 28th in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, at that time they were taking in the big cities only the men, and the smaller cities whole families of Polish origin, and shipping them to Poland. There was a young man by the name of Herschel Greenspan, whose parents were suffering from this deportation. And he was so angry, he got himself a gun, went to the French embassy, he was in Paris, and he shot one of the embassy officials, a person by the name of Parat. And that supposedly was the excuse for the coming Kristallnacht. Well, we know that this is not so, because my brother's birthday is October the 27th, and he turned 15 the night that my father was picked up. Therefore, the lists were compiled before, and he was not on the list. This is just one little example of how they had already arranged all the histories that we're going to do. In the morning of October the 28th, my mother wanted to keep my brother home. Don't go to school. He went to the Adassius Royal School in Berlin. Don't go there. And she kept him as long as she could, but he did go. Luckily, he went late. And because he went late, he missed another roundup where the Nazis went and took all the boys over 15. So that was a lucky escape for him. We were now, the 3 of us, my brother, my mother, and I, and thinking of what to do. We knew we had to get out. We knew that we had to leave. My mother began the rounds of the various consulates, South American consulates, the Uruguayan, the Paraguayan, the Peru. They sold visas, which he got, but they were worthless. The only, what shall I say, benefit that came out of that, I learned geography because of all these things. Meanwhile, as I was going to school, I would try to hide in doorways to miss out on the stones that were being thrown at Jewish children when they could find them. And they were preparing for Kristallnacht. We had mail from our father. We knew he was all right. He stayed on the border town. He chose not to go further into Poland to lodge where his parents are and siblings, and my mother's siblings, so that as soon as he was allowed to come back, he could do it more quickly. Meantime came Kristallnacht proper, November the 9th, 1938. We were in our apartment, and we lived in the apartment houses, it's been a little bit like a U-shape. And in the courtyard, you had a business or a factory. We had our shul. This was our shul, Bet Zion. And therefore, when they came on that night, we could stand at the window, although there was a blackout. We could see everything that they did. We heard everything, we saw everything. They were not allowed to set fire to our shul because of a chemical factory further on, but they destroyed whatever they could. They threw out the Sifrei Torah, all the Sforim, all the Sidurim, whatever they did, benches, they managed to heave-ho and throw them out. And we saw all this, and we also heard them say one to another, I think up there's still some Jews living. And we thought they were going to come up and because they did in many places, but they didn't, and we were all right. Meantime, we also had to give up half of our apartment. We had a nice big apartment with 2 entrances. We had to give up half of it to another Jewish family. They said, we don't need such a big place. Everything we saw from our window. And the next morning, my relatives who lived around the corner, my uncle who had a huge furniture store on a very big boulevard in Berlin, they asked me to go and look and see what's happening to the store, to make sure that the people who work for them don't steal stuff. I was 11 years old. I went there as I was asked to do, and I stood around and I said, the windows, the plate glass windows were shattered. The glass was all over the place. It's not called Kristalnacht for nothing. That's what it was. And I'm standing around and I'm looking, as I was asked to do. And then a couple of women were looking at me, and I heard one say to the other, I think this is a Jewish girl. Das ist ein jüdisches Mädel. So I said, and I had pigtails and blue eyes, and I didn't particularly look Jewish. However, when I heard that, I turned around and I went home. And what could I tell them? What could I tell them? That there were mobs out there, and it was frightening. Meantime, I had another uncle of mine who was engaged to my aunt who was living with us, my tante Kathy, and he also had a furniture store, not such a big one, and he was really what we call Aryan looking, tall, thin, not a, very, very, I would say almost Goyish looking. And he went to his store to see what would happen to his place. And they were painting the big red paint of J, Jude, on his windows, on the storefront, and smashing and so on. And apparently, one of the people recognized him and took his paintbrush and painted him all over his face, red paint. He came home to us, and I can see still how my mother and my aunt worked on his face to try and get that red paint off his face to make him look proper, human again. That's the kind of thing that they did. And so we were stuck, and we were waiting, for my father to come back. Eventually he did, 6 months later, and by that time my mother had registered both my brother and I for Kindertransport, my brother with Youth Aliyah, with Resha Freya, and myself with the Kindertransport proper. And my father came back, I think, about May 1939. Then my brother left for England and Scotland, and we were packing up to go to Poland. The only place that was left for us to go to was back to Lodz. And we gave all our furnishings, whatever we needed, to a shipper, and ask him to send it on. My mother prepared for me a dowry, a dowry in the dunya, because she thought she doesn't know what's going to happen. I'm registered to go to England, and she couldn't give me anything. We weren't allowed to take anything out, but that also was given to the shipper to send to me in England. We got to Poland. It was the end of June, beginning of July 1939. For me, it was a very fun time. I got to know my uncles and aunts, my cousins, lots of them, my grandparents. My mother had taken me to Poland 2 years earlier to see everybody, but I really didn't get to know them until this time. So it was a lark. It was a holiday. It was vacation for me. And everybody spoiled me, and I had a very, very nice time. Until my papers came through for England. And my papers came through. My mother prepared for me. She was a master dressmaker. She prepared for me a couple of summer dresses. I had coat, I had shoes. I could only take one little suitcase. And I had to say goodbye to everybody. It was the 30th of July, 1939, my father's 40th birthday. And in the meantime, my Uncle Herman and Tante Peppy, the one with the paint on his face, had gotten married in Berlin in my uncle's house. My other uncle from the other furniture store. You get mixed up, but don't worry. And that's Uncle Gershon. I'll talk to him about some more later. And I remember it was a Friday wedding, and the Shabbat Brachot on Shabbat, and it was very nice. And that day, she gave birth to a little girl. And I remember being very upset that I could not see Tante Peppy's baby. That was really very, but I had to leave. So we went to the station, to the train. My parents, of course, came with me. And my father took me to the train compartment. My mother stayed behind a little bit. She didn't come all the way to the compartment. And when I look back and think that she had already sent off her son, and now me, so I understand that she really could not do it all the way. She just couldn't. I came, there was a gentleman in the same compartment. My father said to him, could you please keep your eye on my little girl? He said yes, and I never saw him again. But I came to Berlin. I knew where to go. I was familiar with the surroundings. But the day that I arrived, one transport left. So I had to wait 10 days in Berlin by myself for the next Kindertransport. I knew where to go. There was a children's and women's hostel not far from me, a very full place. I remember the director and his wife were both deaf mutes, but they had normal children. All these things I saw as a child and impressed me very much, and I guess that's why I remember it. And I managed for the 10 days. Also, my father had asked that I please go to the shipper and tell him our shipment has not arrived yet, and why not? And he said, no, he sent it. It never came, he never sent. It's the usual story of what happened to people's goods. My Kindertransport left, as I said, 10 days later. I guess I went to the station, I found the right group. I guess somebody must have helped me. The real details of that are a little bit fuzzy. But I got on the train and I got through Holland, which was already wonderful once you get past the German border and the Dutch people come in and they welcome you with cocoa and goodies, and on to England and to London. Now that I'm not going to go into because that's another whole another whole different story. Tonight we're talking about Kristalnacht. I made it short on purpose because I want to go fast forward. Fast forward to our trip, my husband and I, to Berlin. On the third time they invited me, because I'm born there, they wanted me to come and be their guest. And I kept saying no, but the third time they invited us, my husband said, let's go. He wants to go to Frankfurt, he wants to go to Kassel, where he was born. Frankfurt, he was in yeshiva. I said, okay. We went. This was in June of 1996, 20 years ago. We were very well taken care of. We were wined and dined. And then we, of course, went on our own to look at my old neighborhood. We found my school. It was still a school, not a Jewish school, of course, but it was still a school. We went to the shul. Our shul was standing intact, the whole building. It was a warehouse. We met there, an elderly lady in the courtyard, and we asked her, do you remember this synagogue? She says, I remember people coming and going all the time. Yes, she remembered. I went up the stairs to our apartment. It was on the first floor. Up the stairs. I stood in front of the door. We had two entrances. That's why we had to give up half the apartment. One here and one on the side. And I stood there. And I stood there. I did not knock on the door. I'm sorry to this day that I didn't, but I didn't. People were living there, obviously. In any case, we saw that, and at that time, the big reform shul, the Oranienburger shul, was being rebuilt, was made into a museum, and we took a tour. And the very interesting part was that there were a lot of Russians there already. This is in '96. The guide at this big temple was a Russian, a red-haired, red-bearded Russian. Perfect German, of course, and that was his job, because that was he was doing. And we had altogether a good trip. We went to Kassel, where my husband was born. Nothing was left. Everything had been bombed out. He didn't find the house where he lived, the school where he went, nothing. We went to Frankfurt, didn't find too much there either. But I will tell you that at that time in Berlin, you know, we had been in the Russian sector, and it was very dilapidated. The whole area, very dilapidated. Even now, when we went back 3 years ago, it's been rebuilt and redone, but you can still see the neighborhood that is a lower class neighborhood, I would say, because they were under the Russians such a long time. So our shul in Bet Zion at that time had a plaque not in the shul, but on the entrance to the building. You go into the building, you have apartments on both sides, and you go through, and there's the courtyard of the shul. And there on one side is a big plaque saying, this shul, this Bet Zion, was built in 1890 by the Ostjuden, the Jews from Eastern Europe. That plaque is still there till today. That's still there now. All right, we had our trip, and I'm going to go forward a few more years now. 2006. In 2006, my daughter, her husband, and two of their sons decided to take a trip Ben Hazmanim to Berlin. And I made sure to tell them exactly where to go and where to look, and the house and the shul, which is the same building, obviously, and the school, and look at this and look at this, and don't forget this and that. Fine. They went, and a few days later, I received a phone call from my son-in-law. So I said, how are you doing? How is it? Yeah, fine, fine. I said, so did you go? Did you see the shul? He said, yeah, we saw the shul. But not only we saw the shul, we davened mincha there. I said, what? what do you mean you daven mincha there? Yes, you daven mincha there. How? What's happening? And they told me that they were opening a yeshiva. The Ronald Lauder Foundation had bought up the whole block and decided to open the shul, make a yeshiva there, rebuild. The shul proper became the beis medrash, next to it the dining hall, and our apartment was to be the dormitory. Fine. When I heard this, I had very mixed feeling. I was very not happy. I thought, why? Why there, of all places? Who needs it? Berlin, yeshiva, let them all come here. What for? We have this country. Why did that have to be there? It really disturbed me very much. However, they carried on. They had there some young yeshiva boys from Connecticut who were helping them to establish. Rabbis came from the States to establish, to organize, and so on. But that was in 2006. 75 years after Kristalnacht in 2013, my brother and I were invited to come and be guests at the commemoration in Bet Zion, in our shul. We were told we can bring 2 people with us. My 2 sons came with me, and my brother came, Kindertransport, with about 22 of his family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren even. It was quite a clan. It was wonderful. So we arrived there. It so happened that the 9th of November was a Shabbat, so the ceremony was on a Sunday. We got there, David on Thursday, my second came on Friday, and we toured around, and again I showed them my school, which was now a very fancy restaurant, but the shul was the shul. The shul was there, and it had been redone and rebuilt. In front of the shul, you have a little Litke, what do you call it? A little booth, thank you, with a police. You had to, and every shul in Berlin had a policeman. So if you were looking for a certain shul, you didn't know exactly where it was, look for the policeman. Then you would know that's a shul. And they didn't want to first let us in. They said, no, you can't. I said, we came here for such and such a purpose. Oh, excuse me, fine. We got in and we saw, and that was there was no problem. This was. We have to remember the place where we grew up, my brother and I. This was the shul. This was part of our home. It was attached to our own apartment, so to speak. You know, we practically lived there. My father was the bar korah. My uncle, who lived around the corner, was the bar tekiah and the gabbai. So it was a very, very definite family project, so to speak, the shul. At the same time that we were there, there was also the conference of the European rabbis. They have this conference once in 2 years, and among the Rabbanim there was also Rav Lau, our chief rabbi here now, and he joined us for a few of the meals and ceremonies. He spoke to us on Shabbat morning at Kiddush, and also in the evening, which I'll talk about in a little while. So, because of that, we had various Rabbanim with us who really made a big difference to the whole ceremony and everything that was going on there. You could see later some of the photos that I put out. We had a very nice Shabbat. I wanted very much for my son David, who has a beautiful voice, to daven, but they already had everything arranged, so we couldn't do that. it's very special. However, my youngest son, Gedalia, managed on the Monday morning, before he left for the airport, he asked the Rabbi, can I please lay in this shul where my father was a Bar Korah? And he did. Very, very special for him. On the Shabbat, while the men were being spoken to by various rabbis, I was asked to speak to the ladies on Shabbat morning after shul before lunch, which I did. And very interestingly, there were young ladies, very blondish and Russian looking, as you would think, you know, the Russian look like, and all with shekels. Each one has a shekel. It was just really something to look at. So I spoke to them and I told them a little bit of my story of growing up in Berlin, in this shul, in this neighborhood, in this house, and so on. And a couple asked me, where are you from? I said, well, I live in Yerushalayim. Oh, you live in Yerushalayim. And the eyes went wide and the face lit up. I said, yes. Would you like to be there? Oh yes, we're going to go live in Yerushalayim, absolutely. Meantime, what did your husbands do? They are learning smicha. These are all young Russian people, you have to understand. All Russian Jews, all coming back to Judaism because of what's happening now. They're all Balei Tshuva. They're nobody was born like this. And it was very, very interesting. On Shabbat at Kiddush time, I always like a cup of coffee at Kiddush time, not most people do, right? So there wasn't any, there was tons of food. Salmon, so much salmon, wonderful. But there was no coffee, and I saw a very tall, very blonde, shaven young woman with a cup of coffee. So I asked her, where did you get the coffee? So she said, I'll get it for you. So she went somewhere in the kitchen, but I'm telling you, everything was what we call Hochdeutsch. You know, real high German. And it's a funny thing, I was very little, I was very young when I left Germany, but somehow I managed with the language. I had no problems, and I had to do a lot of translating for my children also. On Friday night, I'm talking about the same Shabbat, we were invited to a wonderful family. We split up in two families. 12 of us went to the family called Fabian, and my nephew, another nephew with his family went to another one. This was the host, the young man, was originally from Eastern Europe, I think Romania. His family. But he was born here, they lived in Israel, and they were Yardim to Berlin. So you think, you know, who does that? A lot of people are doing that now, unfortunately, we know. But, and she was from Switzerland, from Zurich, from family. And they told us a story that when they tried to read the shidduch between these two, her family said, what? Not interested in somebody who's living in Berlin, who did this kind of thing. However, they did meet, and the result we saw with 4 gorgeous children from age 0 to 7. It was a beautiful Friday night, and it very, very memorable. All the conversation that went on among ourselves and with them. It was very special to be with a family to see how they live. On Motzei Shabbat, my brother and I were interviewed by Mr. Friedman from the newspaper Yatet, the Hebrew newspaper Yatet. We both spoke to him, my sons, but also we joined in to give him as much information as we could. And when the paper came out, guess who wasn't in there? Okay. Okay, so I'm here to tell the tale. I have some samples of the paper there, and you will see a picture of my brother standing in our apartment, pointing the window to the shul. Here's the shul. He's standing inside the apartment, and he's pointing to the shul, the apartment which is now the dormitory. And I have another copy. You can look later. You also have pictures of all the rabbanim of the Conference of European Rabbis, and you also have a picture of all of us, our families, together at the end of the tekes. My brother, Oliver Sholem, I lost him about a year ago. He was the main speaker on the Sunday night. He's an orator. He spoke about growing up in Berlin, in that house, in that shul, how it was. He mesmerized the whole audience. And I won't go into his speech because I couldn't. However, it's available. Yankee, where? Internet? It's available on internet. It's worthwhile. I'll tell you later how.
YouTube.
YouTube, okay. At the very end of the speech, when everybody was mamash hanging onto his every word, he said that 70 years ago, we were thrown out, so to speak. We were non-persons, we weren't allowed to stay. I'm here 75 years later. I have, to the eye and horror, about 75 great-grandchildren. I'm here with my sons, my daughters-in-law, grandchildren, even great-grandchild was there, I believe. And he held in his hand, there's a picture there too somewhere, he held in his hand the shofar that our Uncle Gershon blew every yontiv in that shul. And in the end, he gave the shofar to his grandson, who blew it, right there in the shul, right there and then. He also made a shehecheyanu. And you can imagine that there was not a dry eye there in the place. And that was a real culmination of this 75th commemoration of Kristallnacht. There's a lot more to tell. That night, at night we went to the famous Brandenburger Tor, and there they were preparing a big tekes citywide for that, with all the rabbis there. It was very moving. So now that I'm back here and talking about it, and the reaction that I had originally in 2006 when my daughter and son-in-law were there with their boys, I will say that now that I've been there and seen what they have accomplished and what they've established, there's a seminary of some 50 girls. There's a kindergarten of I don't know how many kids. And the yeshiva, of course, and the young people, the young light, the young married couples. I will say that because where they came from the former Soviet Union, they would not be able to accomplish here, I'm afraid, what they are accomplishing there. They wouldn't get the support, they wouldn't get the chizuk, so to speak, that they get there. So what they're doing there, hopefully a lot of them will be able to come here. But I think a lot of them will also be going back to Russia to educate those Jews that are still there, and there are plenty of them there, as we know. So after having been very upset at hearing the first news about what was happening to our shul, I'm now a bit calmer because I've seen what's being accomplished and I've seen the people who are there. And perhaps this is also the will of Hashem, that this is what He wants, They have to be there, they have to establish there in order to spread the word of Torah further and further. I would like to leave a little bit time for some questions if you have. I haven't covered everything I know, but I thought perhaps you would want to ask something, so I'm happy to be able to, if I'm able to answer. I will also say that there's a reason why this story has to be told. It's a long time. It's now 78 years. So why do we have to keep repeating it? Every year we have a tekas in the Chovevei Shul tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. I hope you'll all go there. And because those of us who remember, who are still around, Baruch Hashem, can tell the story. But after this, what will happen? We don't know. We hope that history will keep on telling the story as it was, but there's no guarantee. So as long as we are around to tell it, we should do it. Maybe?
I was wondering what language your brother spoke when he spoke. When your brother spoke, that you said it's on YouTube, that he mesmerized.
Oh, yeah.
What language was he speaking to them?
He was speaking in German. We just put in Eli Wachler Berlin, and you'll find it on YouTube.
But he spoke in German.
Yeah.
Yes, he spoke in German. Do they have subtitles?
There is a version with subtitles if you look very hard.
Okay. All the people.
There is a version with subtitles, but you've got to look for it.
What's called?
Eli Wachler Berlin, and in YouTube you'll find it.
Thank you very much for coming.
I don't have a question, but I thought you said that you felt badly that when you went back, you didn't knock on the door. A friend of mine, about 70, grew up hearing about her mother and her grandmother's lifestyle, a description of her grandmother's lifestyle, and she went on a trip, one of these women trips back in Poland, about 20 years ago. And they gave them a few hours off to do their own personal thing. So she took a taxi and she went to the building where her mother grew up. And she knocked on the door and a Polish woman answered. And she said, you know, my mother grew up here, do you mind if I just come in and look around the apartment? And she sees at the end of the long hallway on the credenza the exact life from her grandmother. So the woman says, nope, I won't let you in this apartment, and she slams the door. So meanwhile she had a taxi waiting downstairs. So I don't know how she had the guts, but she knocked again. And the woman opens up and says, I told you I won't let you in. And just at that second, the kitchen phone rang. The woman ran to answer the phone. My friend grabbed the latch. I don't know if it was the smartest or stupidest thing. And she went down to the taxi and
Oh my God. She was very lucky. There are many similar stories.
Hello, my name is Akiva Rosenblum. I was asked to repeat what I said through the talk. I was here this evening with my father and my grandmother, Mrs. Rosenblum. I was very inspired with the speech that I heard about the yeshiva Beit Zion, or the shul that was back then. I actually was there on the night of Kristalnacht in 2013. I studied in the yeshiva Beit Zion, which took place in the shul Beit Zion. I learned there from the year 2000, from May 2013 to January 2015. The place is growing and growing and growing. There's so many religious Jews in the community, and it's just amazing. The apartment that where Mrs. Litke lived was where I went around a lot there. My bedroom was actually just across the window where Mr. Fachla was standing. It was very inspiring that night to hear about the place, that there's a lot of history and a lot of Jewish history, and see the people that actually lived in Brunnenstrasse 33 on that same building where I studied in yeshiva over about 75 years later, learning Torah, davening every day. I used to daven very often as a chazan in the main shul there, also on regular days and also on Shabbases, and it was just very, very inspiring. Today there's about 130 kids in the kindergarten, and like I said, I think the apartment where Mrs. Litke lived today actually turned into a kindergarten, if I'm not wrong. And I was very, very inspired of being here tonight, and thank you to the OU Center and to actually my grandmother, which told me, come here tonight. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for sharing.